have you spoken to us over these 10 years? So
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, every other year from the sounds of it.
yeah. Thanks so much, bud,
Friend of the
for doing
show,
this with us.
as they say, friend of the shows.
Exactly. Yeah.
It takes me 2 years to find something interesting to talk about. It's probably more truthful.
Right, over to you, bud.
Okay, so we're going to talk about my real world cost management journey. So I'm Mike Stephenson, based up in Newcastle. As Simon said, I've been to the user group quite a few times in the past. I'm always happy to come down and visit Leeds to come and see you guys when you go back in person as well. Um, so I've been an architect. I'll jump to my next slide. So I've been an architect in the Azure world ever since it first went into preview, delivering real world projects. And during the last, so I've always worked in that integration space, Azure space, but during the last year, I've got more actively involved in cost management. Um, Really, it came to it from the fact that a number of customers I'm working with are very interested in how do we make sure we're spending money efficiently on the cloud. Um, because of that, I spent a year sort of um, helping customers get a handle on their ever increasing Azure bill, figuring out how to optimize cost. Off the back of that, I'm now the product owner for a product called Turbo 360. One of the modules that they have is something that helps you with cost management. So I've kind of been spending my time with Saravana helping to build tools to do this. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about Turbo 360 while some of the screenshots will be more about that. But really what I want to get across is the principles of cost management are very applicable regardless of what tools you do. So everything I show you today, you can do it with the Azure out of the box tool, and to a degree, you can do it with third party products from other vendors. You can do it yourself. Um, what I hope is that you like what you've seen and people would be interested in chatting to me more about specifically Turbo 360. But at the same time, really just what I want as a minimum is to give you guys ideas when you go back to your projects about things that you can do that'll help save money. So the takeaway from today should be that everybody should go home with ideas about how they can save money on their projects. On the next couple of slides, I'm going to do a survey, and I'll invite you guys to join. So if you stick either that URL or that QR code in the browser, my survey should come up in a second, and we can see what you guys think about things. If you let me, just give me a thumbs up, guys, when you are on the survey, and I'll move to the next slide. So I think everybody looks like they're okay. So really, question one is: what is your current Azure spend in your organization, uh, or on the projects that you're working on right now? You guys managed to get onto that survey, okay? Yeah, perfect. So what we tended to find, it was interesting. I ran this survey last week at a big conference with 300 people in, and there was such a range of answers here that there was definitely more. Most people were in this kind of range here, that 50 to 100. There was a lot of people had no idea what the Azure cost was quite interesting. Oh, my button's not working there. Give me a second. Right, so the next question is, how often does your organization or team review your Azure costs? Yeah, yeah. So that's really in line with last week. So a lot of people just aren't reviewing costs at all. It was interesting actually last week. We did have some people who said once a month or more often, but generally the thing we find a lot is a lot of people aren't really looking at their costs unless people complain about this. So this is the journey about what I was doing over the last couple of years. So we've been working on a long-term integration project with Azure, multiple projects running concurrently at the same time, delivering lots of different business units doing integration. So it was things like new HR systems, new whole new elements of whole new business units were created that needed integrations for apps they were buying. Really complicated project. The really important thing here was that this seesaw shows that everything was all about transform the business, deliver value, enable users to create new revenue, get new customers. And the trade-off was that sustainable costs weren't really the primary concern. And I think this is a good theme for everybody for cloud over the last sort of probably 5 or 6 years, is that the focus has been so much on delivering stuff that people haven't really focused on, once we deliver it, can we maintain these costs? And I think that's a trend that's starting to change. And I think if you're not seeing that in organizations right now, I think it's something you'll see a lot of in the coming year. So this story is about how I transformed the cost management in this project at this customer. So where we started was the biggest challenge is that customers have the problem that nobody's really responsible for cost data. So if you look at different organizations, you'll have somebody who has access to the bill and data, but they have no idea, is that money spent effectively or not? You have people who understand the solution and know what it does, but have no idea what the spend is. You have management who may see these high level cost views that show, this month we spent 40,000, but I've got no idea what that breakdown is, what that's made up of. And really what kind of happens is everybody takes a step back when it comes to cost management, and they say it's not really my job to do this. So because it's nobody's job, it doesn't get done. And the net result of that is that slide previously, we look at the cost when the boss complains about it, is really what happens for many companies. So what we did is, in this case, this is a screenshot from Table 360. You could just as easily be using one of any other tool or the Azure bit. You start looking at cost data. Now, what we did, that was the key thing, was this democratize cost data. So you guys are all in the Power Platform Office 365 world. You're familiar with this idea of democratization. So can we empower users to do something, instead of just integration and app building? In this case, we're trying to empower users to have access to cost data to be able to do something. So what we did is we imported all of the cost data into Table 360. We created this tree view that models out who has what cost. So in this case, we were looking at a team-based cost. Here's all of the costs for the integration team on that node on the tree. We can go and break it down further into different areas if we wanted, but we wanted to start with the integration team costs. And then for the integration team, I can go and look at things like here, we're looking at the analysis, and I can create views of my cost data. So here, what I was looking at is, this is last month, this is this month. How's the trend going on our costs? Does it look the same? Have we got any spikes or significant changes in cost? And when it comes to democratization, so the big challenge often for many companies is it takes a manager to go, we need some reports of the cost data. It takes days to get the data processed, extracted, put into a format people can use, and then people either don't really do anything with it, or just the process of getting that data to be able to get an insight takes too long, and it becomes non-actionable. So people just kind of every 6 months they may look at the cost data, complain about it, do nothing, and then 6 months later it just keeps getting bigger. So here, by democratizing cost data, we can start making it so it's very easy for anybody in the team to see what's happening with your in this case, the integration team. It could be a certain application or department. You can see what's happening anytime you want. That's what your costs are up till this point. And that's step one. And that's really, that democratization of cost data is one of the foundation principles of FinOps, which is, how can I put the cost data close to the people who run the application, because they're best placed to work out if that costs good value for money. Now, the next thing that we did was we needed to create some monitoring. So you can do monitoring in a number of different ways. What we wanted to do is, instead of having to create monitoring at the scope of the the resource group or the subscription, it gets really quite complicated quite quickly. I wanted to just start with the overall integration team, and I want to create two things. So number one, I want a group budget where I can say, here's the cost that I expect, and you could do like daily, monthly, whatever. So we just had this line here which says we've got a monthly spend of this. Have we hit that red line? Yes, then we raise an alert. And we also had anomaly detection, which is looking at what is your cost on a regular basis. Is there anything that looks out of order? And if there is, we get an alert off it. So they're the two most common types of monitoring that you're going to want as a budget and an anomaly. And then what we did is we had any alerts we get, we fire them to teams to tell people, look, something doesn't look right in today's billing data, go and check it out. We also had an escalation policy. So if nobody checked it out, we then create a proper ticket in ServiceNow to say to people, look, here's a ticket, treat it like a bug, put an SLA on it, and then you can track it just like any other support issue, which I think is a good thing to do because sometimes people forget and don't do anything about the cost. And again, that comes back to the problem of not fixing the issue. So step 3, after we put our monitoring in place, we now start doing cost reviews. So one of the views that I would use is I'm looking at a list of the services used in my integration team, and obviously they're grayed out a little bit here, but you'd get the flavor of how much did we spend last month on Logic Apps, how much did we spend this month. We've actually had quite a good saving this month to last month in this case, but as you go down the list, there'll be other things where the cost's gone up. And and things like particularly consumption costs, you might find some costs go up and down on a monthly basis. What we tend to find is when it comes to a cost review, you want to start, number one, you want to make it quick and easy to do. Number two, you want to be able to drill down. So I could do something like start with a service level here. How much am I spending on API management, Logic Apps? I can change it up here to change it by resource. So I can look at individual resource changes. The things that I tend to find with a cost review are there's different things that typically happen on a month. It's really rare that your costs will be exactly the same one month to the next. So it's often things like we deployed something new, therefore our costs changed. We changed the configuration of something, so the costs went up. Sometimes it's things like Microsoft made a change. So we'll talk later about a change Microsoft made that increased our costs that we didn't know about. It can be things like the usage of your application can go up and you might not necessarily spot that. So we had a really good one where Covi, they have a product called Document 360, which is an online knowledge-based product, and they had Midjourney as a customer. And if you guys can imagine, Midjourney is a bit like a ChatGPT for images. When ChatGPT started going crazy, Midjourney's usage of Document 360 went through the roof. They were a really small customer who came and signed up online. Nobody knew who they were. Suddenly they started getting 50 million hits a month, almost overnight because of the AI kind of chaos that went on. And the question is like, how do you manage that in your cost data? And if you weren't reviewing your costs or monitoring your costs, you might not know straight away till it becomes a problem that your costs are being affected by this increase in the success of one of your customers can drive an increase in your costs. So the next thing we did after reviewing the costs, so what we were really doing is we were spending 20 minutes a month, review our costs, talk about any changes, and kind of come up with some actions to do. One of the actions we might do would be optimize the costs. Now, there's a few different ways you can optimize costs. So number one, you've got things like reservations. So you can look at ways of getting a discount by committing. You could look at right sizing, which is one of the things we'll talk about today as well. And the other one's workload optimization. So one of the things we did was we looked at tuning when our Logic Apps are turned on and off. So the first thing you might imagine is for Logic Apps, the cost model is consumption based if you're on consumption Logic Apps. So you expect a Logic app's going to be really cheap. However, if you had, in this case, we had 80 Logic Apps constantly polling Service Bus for messages. And there's a tiny little cost for each time it checks for a message, but that scales up. So if you multiply that tiny little cost, I can't remember the exact cost it was, but it's like a fraction of a cent. hitting that every 30 odd seconds, times it by 80 logic apps, times that by 5 environments, times that by the entire month, and that adds up to a significant amount of money. Now, what we were able to do here, we used a scheduler feature. So you can see I've created a window where these logic apps are turned on and off. And what I was able to do was just by turning them off outside of office hours in the non-production environment. So, end of the day, nobody's going to be testing. So we turn them off. We actually saved $1,000 a month just by turning them off when they weren't being used, because overnight they weren't processing any messages. So to show the impact of that, putting the schedule on, this shows the increase in costs as we were going through the use of these logic apps being deployed. And this is just one of the environments. So what we were able to do, this was the dev environments. They're sitting, checking for messages. In the dev environment, we can actually turn them off most of the time, because unless the developer's working on them, they don't need to be running. So here, turned it on, schedule drops it down to a couple of cents a day that it costs, instead of $7 or $8 a day that it was costing. Now, what happened next, if we looked at that previous one was the dev environment, but if we look at all of the environments combined, so looking across all of the logic apps, what you would see is this was the production environment. Starting, as we start deploying stuff into production, you can see that cost going up. The non-prod environments are obviously higher than production to begin with, because they're getting tested. As things go into production, you can see here was where it overlapped, and production kind of continues with an upward cost as more integrations get deployed, as the volume of messaging goes up. But what happened is we put the scheduler in, and that started leveling off the non-production environments, so that you can see here, particularly this environment came down a lot because it doesn't get used that much. But really, we're keeping that non-prod environment much lower than the prod environment. Next thing we did was we started looking at right sizing. So the idea of right sizing, if you're not familiar with it, is if I've got, probably the simplest example is if I've got a VM, if I deploy that VM, I check how it's running. I find that it's over capacity. So a VM might be a large VM, but the users are only using enough resource to really warrant a small VM. Can I downsize that VM and save some money? So the challenges around right sizing really come about because people deploy stuff and they never go back and check, was it effectively used? They really, unless the user complains, they just sit there happy that the users aren't complaining, that VM's doing a good job. But when you start looking at some of the VMs in an organization, you find that they have wastage all over the place. So what we did here in Turbo 360, the first challenge is I might have hundreds and hundreds of VMs. How do I work out which ones the integration team cares about? So here we've got the integration team, we've got their optimization section, and here's a list of VMs that they have. And with these VMs, some of them will have downgrade recommendations, which is this bit here. So really what this was saying was that these VMs weren't being used much. So they're currently on a DS4. They could be downgraded to a standard B2. So these were data gateway VMs. Again, a lot of them are in the non-prod environment, not being used very heavily. Now, what you might find is that in this case, the cost could come down from $140 to $30 a month. Now, that might be quite a small saving, but if you look at the organizations, how many VMs they typically have, it's quite easy for those VMs to really count up. So if you had 100 VMs with $100 savings a month each, that quickly gets to quite a big number. And you'll see a good example of that later in the talk about the volume of right sizing that could be out there that people are missing. There's a good example here as well. This one's a SQL Azure database where we could change it from 100 DTUs to 50 DTUs, and again save a little bit of money. So for the integration team, we were just looking at all of these little tunings that we could do to just save money and be efficient and really chop wastage out of the environment. What we're able to do actually as well on this screen, when I want to analyze that VM there, I can click on it, and here I'm looking at the kind of the metrics showing me what that VM's actually doing. So a lot of the times you'll find a VM might be a certain size, but the CPU, memory, and other counters are already telling you it's not doing very much, and that helps you work out if the recommendation's a good one. So I think when it comes to right size, and what you really want is to find the needles in the haystack. There'll be a lot of things that you can probably right size. How do I work out which ones will give me the biggest savings in the shortest period of time? And I'll just work through them in cost saving order. Start with the biggest, work through them. If you can do 10 a week or something, 10 a month, quite quickly you're going to see a good return on that time spent optimizing. The next one's reservations. So step 6, we're looking at where in our platform could we take a reservation that would reduce our costs. So for anybody who's not familiar with a reservation, basically this means that, take again a VM example. So if I deploy a VM, I could say to Microsoft, I'll commit to using so many cores of this size of VM for this period of time, and then you're giving Microsoft predictable capacity or predictable demand. They'll give you a discount for that commitment. So here, what you can see is I've got a bunch of app services here. We've got a recommendation to potentially purchase a reservation. Current costs $400. If I take a 3-year reservation, that drops to nearly 200. So there's a big saving potential there. Now, this is where when you start looking at reservations, these will apply for a number of different resource types like VMs, app services, SQL, that kind of thing. Where it starts getting interesting is you have to make decisions at this point. So if you think about the steps we've gone through so far, the easiest one to do is to take a reservation. So let's say if I had this app service, I could do absolutely nothing and just say, right, I'm going to commit for a year, and I get almost a 30% saving there, or 25% in a bit, I think it is. If I do something like a right size, I'm going to change the plan size. So I have to think about the impact assessment of that. Now, it might be better for me to do a right sizing, but I have to do some work to do it. I have to say, right, if I change this from large to medium, what does that mean for my application performance? So right size, and what you might do is take a reservation for a year, which buys you time to impact assess the right size, and especially if you've got a lot of machines to think about, and then you can come up with a plan and work through the plan about implementing the right size. And you can also do things like we did some stuff with certain VMs where we might right size them first and then schedule them. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well, where we can, a reservation, say, gives you a 30 or 40% reduction, but if you schedule it, you might get like a 60% reduction, because 60% of the time you don't need it to be a large, it can just be a small. So you've got to decide what the right thing is for each resource here. One of the examples, so with the scheduler, you can see here we had these data gateway VMs, so we could turn them off and turn them on here. So on that window, we might say turn it on at 8 a.m., turn it off at 6 p.m. We could also do things like resize it, I was saying before. So we could make it a large or a small, and there's a number of different ways you can configure that resizing based on the schedule, but you get some good savings on that as well. As we start getting through the steps, so at that point we'd gone through a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We're then starting to look at our impact assessing our cost data through reviews to see where we can now start tuning stuff after we dealt with the low-hanging fruit. So here we had a really interesting one where we had storage defender costs started showing up in our cost data, and at this point we had some function apps and storage accounts and logic apps that had been deployed for quite a while. Nobody had ever configured Defender for these storage accounts, but suddenly we're getting charges. You can see here there's ones like $50 a month that you're getting charged for Defender on a storage account, and it's like, well, where did this come from? We haven't configured anything. What's that for? So this is where your analysis data, you start getting insights into what you've deployed in Azure, how much it's costing you. and why are you paying that money for something, especially in this case when we weren't sure what it was. So what we did here is we started doing some analysis on this cost, where we basically identified the cost and drilled down on it. And what we found was that for these storage accounts, Defender is charged per transaction. So here you can see we're getting 1.6 million storage transactions per day for this storage account, and actually all it gets used for is by a function app. So what was happening, if I go on the next slide, is we had this function app deployed. It's got a pull and trigger for things like event hub and service bus in it. As part of managing those triggers, it's interacting with a storage account to update certain information. It's not business data, it's like the runtime under the hoods using the storage account. And if you look here, that's the cost that we're paying for Defender on that storage account. Now, I said we didn't know where Defender came from because this was deployed originally before Defender for storage was even a thing. And what happened was one of two things: either Microsoft by default turned that on, or somebody in the organization turned it on at subscription level, so it applied to all storage accounts. And what was happening was, so we had 1.6 million transactions per day. You're paying $0.2 per 10,000 transactions. So that basically means you're paying about $3.20 per day. That rolls up across all of the storage accounts. I think it basically worked out to be about 7,000 a year we're paying for Defender for storage for function apps that we weren't paying when we first deployed that solution. So that's when I'm saying you can have a new cost that comes into your environment from something you haven't done and something you didn't know was happening. So really at this point, we had two choices. We either turn Defender off or we change the price plan. So the reason turn Defender off is an option is because Defender is really about protection of the storage account, aimed primarily at your business data that you store in that storage account. So we're not holding any business data in there, for one. So things like, if you look here, you've got things like malware scanning on data uploads. We're not doing anything like that. So there's a question about whether we actually need Defender. But the other thing is we could actually change to a flat rate price plan, which would be $10 a month, which we could just do that for each storage account, and that would drop that cost from $50 to $100 a month. I think was the ballpark for the full month. We can get that down to $10, and I think all in all that reduced the Defender cost from something stupid like $7,000 a year down to like 1,000 a year. So it's a big saving off such a little thing. Now, as we went through this as a team, we were trying to follow the concept of the FinOps maturity model. So really their model is this. So we have companies that crawl, walk and run as they get better at doing cost management. What we find, putting aside this example, one of the things I've found speaking to a lot of companies about cost management is a lot of companies are in this sit position over here where they're not really doing anything about cost management. I think my survey at the start really backed that up. A lot of people are saying, well, we're not doing cost reviews. We're not doing anything unless the boss shouts about it. So those people are really at the sit position, and I think that's something that you'll see change as you go along. Now, what I'm encouraging is this idea of when you start looking at cost management, the first thing is to analyze your costs, set your monitoring up, look at optimize, and analyze the result of the optimization, update your monitoring, optimize again. And if you go around that kind of cycle, you'll eventually move up this maturity model. Now, what we were looking at doing was bring in something like a monthly cost review. You could even do it as a lot of companies I've spoken to are thinking about doing it as like part of a sprint retrospective. So we look at what are the cost impact of our development and testing for each sprint. That'll help us be better once we go to production. I think that'll be a good way of doing it. But getting this idea of regularly checking the cost to save you time later. Now, as we went through that journey with that team, these were some of the results. So even though those things, maybe seemed quite simple what we were doing, they had quite big results. So things like tuning my logic apps so that they get turned off when they're not being used saved us $12,000 a year. When we were doing the cost reviews, so we found that projects running concurrently meant that one project delivered something. In the future, another project came along that changed an application or replaced an application, that decommissioned certain interfaces that were replaced. We'd end up with resources that were still deployed that weren't used anymore. And projects focus on delivering new stuff. They don't focus on cleaning up after themselves. This idea of who's the garbage man, who cleans up your waste as you go through your cloud journey. And here, I felt before we started really looking at this, we weren't too bad, but we still found 17,000 a year worth of things we weren't really using anymore by doing a bit of right size and getting rid of stuff that wasn't used anymore. It's quite a big saving here. The reservations we put on our app service plans gave us a £6,000 a year saving. And there's a few more down here. So all in all, we found 53,000 a year worth of cost savings in a team that we thought we were pretty efficient beforehand. So that's quite a big number now. What happens after that was what I think will happen at a lot of organizations. There's two types of companies I think will happen, or two patterns I think will happen in companies as they do cost management stuff is, number one, you'll have a team, a bit like this one, I'd call it bottom up. So we had a team who cared about cost management, were doing something, and then other people started copying them. Or you'll have the other time where top down, somebody in the senior management team will go, right, costs have hit this point that too much of a problem. We have to do something about it. And then they'll edict down to everybody to care about cost management. Whichever way it happens, this is really the story you're going to come across. The C-suite people are going to go, the bill just keeps getting bigger, costs are out of control, we need to do something about this. The Azure expert will be the person who can get some of the cost data, but they'll go, either it takes me too much time to find the cost optimizations, I don't have visibility of the data when I need it to really do cost management. You're going to have product owners and project managers who say, we're delivering a project, but I've no idea what my Azure costs are going to be. When we go to production, I can't really predict what the impact's going to be on the costs sustainability. And then we have this FinOps role, which a lot of companies are starting to bring in, where their job's to create collaboration around these different people, but they just can't really do it without the tooling to help them do it. And this is where I'm saying, whatever you do, bring something in, whether it be Azure cost management, another product, or Turbo 360. You really need something to democratize data, to get all these people, talking to each other so they can see what's happening with cost. Now, what happened in this organization is because we were doing a really good job, everybody came to us and said, can you show us how to manage our team's costs? So we looked at different areas of the IT department with the different applications. And I've cherry picked a few stories that I thought were really interesting of things we learned. Just spending, less than a month was spent helping other teams here. But some of the interesting savings we found. So number one's this low use SQL database. So if you're using SQL Azure, there's different cost models from it. One of the ones a lot of people use is something called serverless SQL, and that's a way where you can configure the database so that it should cost next to nothing when it's not really being used. And we set up this data platform, which I knew quite well because I terraformed it originally. And they had a SQL database there, which gets used for basically nothing. It's just got some parameters in this table that they use as part of a data warehousing process. And when I looked at their costs, this was the bit here that jumped out for me. So I was expecting their SQL database, you can see from the key down here, the SQL database should cost maybe $20 a month, absolute tops, but probably next to nothing. And I'm seeing that coming out at $1,000 a month some months. So that was a one straight away. I'm like, right, we need to have a look what's going on here from that cost review. So what happens is if you go into Azure, you'll see this model here, serverless SQL. You can see the cores down here are configured with one core. The estimate over here has shown me, well, this database doesn't really get used very much. We expect this database to be really cheap. So the estimate for the storage costs $11, but the storage is actually almost zero because there's nothing in it. And the V core usage should be next to nothing as well. So the question is, if we've got three of those databases, in dev, test, and production, why are they costing us so much money every month? What was happening was there's a metric called app CPU build, which if you look here, what's happening is the database is a serverless database, so it should go to sleep when it's not being used. And then when it goes to sleep, you stop paying for it. But what I'm seeing here is this metric tells me something's hitting that database on a regular basis that stops it going to sleep. So I can see where regularly hitting one of these CPU build sort of things, that means the database is staying awake. We're going to keep paying for it instead of it going to sleep. So what we did, we found that one of the data platform Synapse pipelines was triggering every few minutes to do, to check for some files. And one of the things it was doing unexpectedly was going and querying this database. And that wasn't really part of how we expected it to be used. So what we did is we can change SQL to change to the DTU model. So you can basically go and change some of these settings here, change it to the DTU model, and you can basically change that database from costing across three environments $1,000 a month. We can get it down to about $20-30 a month because you only need a really tiny DTU based database. So the next thing we looked at was another team who had SQL databases that were really over provisioned. So here, what I was seeing was on our right size, and we're getting a bunch of SQL databases with downgrade recommendations. And the first thing you do is you go for the biggest one. So we had a database that said you can save $4,000 a month by correctly sizing this database. So what I'm seeing here is we've got currently mission critical business database. The first thing that I noticed, it's grayed out here, but when you look at the resource group, I could tell it was in the UAT environment. So the first thing is, why have we got an $8,000 a month database in UAT? And then also, why is it business critical? And we would see this kind of pattern quite regularly, because what happened was people are deploying stuff from a template. The template's just pre-configured for it to be this size of database. It's getting deployed. Nobody's ever looking to see afterwards, is it correct? And the users don't complain because they love the application because it works really well because it's on a huge database. And unless the users complain, nobody really reviews the performance. So what we did is we went in and had a look what's going on. And the first thing that you can do, so if we see down here, there's estimated costs. You can change this. You can change this service tier here from business critical to standard, and it halves the cost immediately. So that, for a non-production database, you would never really need it on business critical. So that immediately halves your cost. You can see the utilization over here says it's not really doing much. When we looked at the utilization though as well, you can see that here it's on 16 cores. We probably don't need 16 cores. So what we ended up doing is we move it down to 8 cores, and then we could schedule it. So we use Turbo 360 to say, let's make it standard. Let's make it 2 cores at night, 8 cores during the day. That was more than enough for that database. And in this case, this particular one, that was a 4,000 database. We got that down to 700 a month, and nobody noticed any difference to the application at all because it was so over provisioned. What we found was that pattern was replicated in a number of teams. Particularly this one team we were looking at had about 5 databases like this. So there was a huge cost saving just for that team that nobody knew was there because they'd never really looked properly to see the problems they were having. So the next one's my oh my god moment. So we had this one day where our alerts sent an alert out saying you've got this cost anomaly. We come in and you can see this here. Straight away, you know, oh my god, that's a big cost increase. That was actually the cost would equate to $35,000 a month. So what was happening here was we had an alert for this new resource that got provisioned. It was a SQL database. It was the biggest SQL Azure database that you could have, had been provisioned. And that's not the worst part of this story. The worst part of the story is I was asking people, right, what is this database used for and why has it suddenly appeared and costing us this amount of money? And nobody knew what it was for, which is quite, you know, that's a pretty bad place to be. So eventually we tracked down that there was a team for a third party vendor who were doing a migration project for some random part of the IT department. And they'd been given, you know, like just get your migration done. So what they'd done is they'd gone and scaled up the database as big as they could to make the migration run as quickly as possible. But they hadn't really told anybody they were doing it. So that's really where this spike came from. And the intention was they would scale it up, do the migration, then scale it back down. So number one, there's an approval issue there. If nobody knows they're doing it, you know, that's a significant cost they could have incurred, especially as you know, Christmas holidays here the next day, everybody's off for 2 weeks. So if they forget to scale that down, you're coming back to a 20 grand spend after Christmas for something that did nothing. Now, there's a couple of things here. So number one's the approval. Number two would be policy. So in Azure, you can put policies in to restrict tiers that you can deploy certain resources to in certain SKUs. So you could protect against that issue with an Azure policy to stop people deploying stuff like that. The other thing is make sure you've got appropriate monitoring in place so that if it does happen, people get alerted and you can do something about it. Next story is about missed reservations. So here we had a really interesting one where, you know, reservations are a real problem that a lot of people don't know they're available. And the problem is sometimes the central admins can see reservations that could be done through recommendations, but they don't really know if they make sense because they don't know what the application does. And the application team doesn't know that the reservation could be there. So what we were doing here is we're looking at the different teams and we can see these resources over here and they've got different reservation opportunities. So some of them VMs, you know, 4 grand a month saving if we take a 1 year reservation on that VM, you know, 7 years if we take a 3 grand, that's just one machine. But if you start looking across machines, you've got 4 grand, 1,000 here, a few hundred there. For big organizations, this can be a huge cost saving and they just don't know it's there because nobody's really taken ownership of figuring out what should we do about this. I've even heard the best story if you watch my FinOps podcast, which I'll tell you about later, was one guy was telling me about a customer who had over $2 million a year worth of reservations. I think it was near a 3. They didn't even know what a reservation was. So it's basically a discount you get from Microsoft for next to no effort. And they just basically poured $3 million down a hole in the ground pretty much. So for us, next big one was right sizing. So we're looking at across the entire organization now, what are the right sizing opportunities to, you know, resize machines. So a lot of these were coming up as downgrade. You can see there's a machine over here is a 12 grand a month VM. And actually, if you look at what it's doing, you could probably run it as a 1,500 a month VM. That's, you know, 10,000 a month that you're getting nothing in return for because that VM's not being used correctly. There was many things like this. So, you know, you can see a few of the examples here. The problem is people, again, just aren't looking to see if these resources are being used the way they've been configured. Sometimes you might get the odd recommendation. So there's one here, I think it's a SQL database where it's saying you might upgrade it because it's being used quite heavily, so you might be better off upgrading it. If you think about what I could be doing organization here, I might have applications with performance issues where I can't upgrade them because people are thinking, oh, we don't want to spend an extra $500 a month on this application. But it's like, well, over here, you could save 10 grand. You could update that database 2 or 3 times, and your overall organization spend still comes down, but your applications are just working better. So I'll skip that slide. There's a couple of other ones I'll mention because I think they're interesting stories. So this one was an example where there was an integration where a partner submits files on an ongoing basis that comes in over FTP. The storage account triggers an event grid, triggers a logic app. The logic app goes and gets the file, processes the data, and loads it into a SQL database. And the team that built that, they built it, deployed it, just works. Processes maybe 10 files a day, costs next to nothing to run. Everybody's happy. And then they had a problem. So what happened was some new admin comes along and they're getting files sent from the same partner that they need to archive. And they were like, well, where should we archive them? We don't really have something. Oh, no, we've got this FTP site over here. We can just upload the files and stick them on the FTP site because that's used for that partner anyway. So they basically built a PowerShell script to upload these files. What they didn't realize was that every time they uploaded a file, it triggers the event grid, triggers the logic app. The logic app goes and gets the file, and then it goes, oh, that's an invalid file, and it just puts it to one side out the way. That's fine. However, what was happening was the original integrations processing 10 files of a specific type a day. This archive process is archiving thousands of files a day, but it also had a bug in the PowerShell script, so it didn't delete the temp directory when it uploaded the files. So the first time it runs, it uploads 1,000 files, then it runs again, uploads 1,000 new files plus the previous 1,000. Then it uploads, 3,000, 4,000. So it's basically just exponentially getting bigger, triggering the logic app every time. And what happened was this ran enough over a weekend that it basically created a £4,000 bill for this scenario, triggering the logic app to process invalid data that was just ignored. The problem here was they had monitoring in place, but nobody was around at the weekend, so nobody responded to the monitoring. And we looked at this idea of a circuit breaker pattern here when we kind of dealt with this issue. So what you can do is basically here in Turbo 360, we created a monitor that monitors the run started. It has an action that says that logic app was expected to get 10 runs a day, or 10, if you get more than 10 runs in an hour, you've probably got an issue that's not expected. That goes and triggers a job to go and disable the logic app. So really what had happened back here is this is an accidental security hack by an internal person who wasn't deliberately trying to cause a problem, but accidentally through naivety didn't know something they did impacted something else. And because you've got consumption cloud, the problem you have is that it just scales. We want cloud to grow and scale as your application does, but there's a cost for doing that. And here, the application just scaled, processed the data exactly as you would want, didn't error at all. It just cost you a load of money because it was processing stuff that you didn't have. And somebody accidentally had a recursive loop down here that cost you a lot of money. Okay, story 7 was remove duplicate processing. So here we have a good example for another logic app again. So we had CSV data coming in. You do a loop here over that data. You get, let's say we've got 2,000 records, so you'll pay a little price for each action to do a 2,000 updates to SAP and CRM. In this case, the problem was that the integration was working really well, but the partner submitting the data stopped, kept submitting records that have already been processed and haven't changed, and they couldn't really do anything about that. So what we had to do was, you'll see here, we had these spikes where messages come in, and then for days here and here, we've got a lot of repeated records where the cost of the logic app per day, you should get a load of records and then there's nothing changed, so the cost should be next to nothing. And then here, these are all duplicate records costing more and more to be processed. So what we could do is we could use an Azure function here to get rid of the duplicate records before we do the loop. And we were able to reduce the cost of that logic app, which got to the point that sometimes it was costing $250 a month to run that logic app. You could get that down to $20 a month just by getting rid of the duplicate processing. And the problem was the partner over here couldn't get rid of the duplicates. We had to do it in the integration, and the the function app usage combined with the logic apps a really cost-effective way of doing that. Okay, so if we think about the summary of those extra stories, so we found 15,000 a year from that SQL database that was supposed to be costing next to nothing. The over-provisioned databases across those teams, we found 100,000 a year cost savings. The unexpected new database that magically appeared was a 35 grand a month database. I think that the reservations and right sizing, you would probably do maybe the right sizing first, then the reservation, but there was definitely in the region of 1.2 million potential savings we identified through that exercise. And that was really in just a month of looking at the other teams, and there's a plan people can work through to implement those cost savings. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the kind of money decent sized organizations could be just wasting. The takeaways from today, so what we want to do is level the seesaw. Before it was all about transformation. Now we want sustainable costs balanced with transformation. I think one of the interesting FinOps concepts that you may start here is something called cloud unit economics. So that's really about what is the cost of my application versus what is the value it brings into my business. So an easy example would be if I've got an application that brings me, 1,000 orders a month worth $1 million. If I've got an Azure application that costs me $1,000 a month to run, that's a really good cloud unit economics, because the profit from it's going to be really significant. But if my application brings in $1,000 a month worth of orders and costs me $800 a month to run, then the economics don't add up quite as effectively. And I think that's the kind of things that'll balance, or it'll kind of help describe these problems. Now, hopefully you guys found this talk interesting. I'll come over for questions on the monitor in a second. There's a couple of things I want to shout out about. So I'm running a podcast called FinOps on Azure. What I'm trying to do is get regular chats with people who are interested in looking at, looking at things like what is the relationship between cost management and security in this case. What are the ways you can optimize Cosmos DB costs? What are the ways you can optimize Logic App costs? And looking at all the different Azure resource types. We're also doing a few white papers. So this one here talks about the idea of giving accountability for teams. So looking at what teams are doing, giving them, putting a layer of governance on top of the engineering operations to make sure you're getting good cost management. So I talk a lot about how I do that at companies, and internally for the teams at Turbo 360. If you are interested in knowing more about Turbo 360, there is a paper about Azure cost management versus Turbo 360 and what the differences are. I hope you guys found that interesting. I think the thing that I'd like to get across is this bit here. There's a huge amount of waste as an industry standard. People like Accenture, Deloitte, Gartner are saying there's 25 to 40% of waste in the cloud spend for most organizations. We were finding, I think generally we were finding about 30%, quite a common number. Even the team, the integration team at the start that I thought was pretty good, we still had about 10% waste in our cloud spend. So be a cost champion now, because your organizations are going to be looking for that later. Spend 30 minutes a month reviewing your costs, and I think you'll find big savings that you didn't know were there. That's pretty much me, guys. I don't know if you've got any questions. I'll come over the chat and flip back to the camera.
Thanks, Mike. God, fascinating, isn't it? God, that is quite scary when you're talking about when the organization which sort of sunk $3 million into VMs, was it which never used. That's incredible. Was it reserved instances?
I don't know
That's
that. So
incredible.
that was so they're probably spending 10 million.
Yeah,
But there's nearly 3 million worth of savings just by purchasing reserved
yeah, wow, yeah,
compute
yeah,
for them. Yeah, it's crazy,
yeah.
man.
It really is. Yeah, we had a customer. Yeah, we I think we saved them 65% by just switching them over to reserved instances. Yeah, they were delighted. And I guess the other
I
thing
think
as well
it's
is if you can save this money, that money then can be used to do another project, or do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
it can be used for other things. So yeah,
yeah, 100%. I think that you hear about people all the time kind of saying, look, we can't fund this project, we can't invest in staff training, we can't get new resources, everybody's maxed out. And it's like, well, look, you're spending $1 million a year on cloud. Even if you've got 5% waste, that's still a big number. So you could go and, you could probably buy 2 or 3 new resources and still save a load of money. And I think the interesting one for me will be, um, IT departments get away with cost management, I think, because people don't understand IT. And I think if you think of any other area of your business, if you found that, if your board found that your HR department had 30% waste in some area of HR, that would have something done about it very quickly.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
an operation, if you think of like a manufacturing plant or a warehouse, if you had huge waste in there, it would be identified and got rid of. And I think in IT, um, you know, organizations don't really fully understand cloud still. Um, People just want applications that do a job, and they haven't really quite figured out that we're spending way more money than we need to achieve that. And I think it'll change a lot. It's happening already. It's starting to change big time, but I think it'll become even more of a thing over the coming months and year.
definitely. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah, as people become more wise to it. Classic sales funnel, isn't it? Don't realize you've got
Yeah,
a problem, and then suddenly realize you've got a problem. Then you see how much money it's costing, and yeah, big difference. Yeah, very cool. That's really good, really interesting.
It's kind of the same thing with storage as well. That for organisations, storage just keeps increasing, and the price is only ever going to go up. And once you've got your data there, then you've got the problem about how you sort your data out. Nobody wants to delete anything, so it's. I think the days of cloud processing, computing, storage, it seemed cheap at one point. And now everybody's got all the data in the cloud, nothing on prem, and then it's just going to keep increasing, and the cost's going to keep increasing. So it's
I
something
think
that.
it's things as well. Like really, I think one of the things we're seeing is because IT, everybody complains about the IT budget, but in reality, that probably 80% of the IT budget doesn't get spent on IT. It gets spent on providing a service for other departments in the business. And the problem with that is those cross charge models don't really deliver properly. So if you saw that, like just for example, let's say the HR department, right? How in your IT budget, do you really know how much of the money of your IT budget really gets spent on HR? And if they knew that, say $1 million IT budget was 800,000 was spent on HR, and the HR department were responsible for that 800,000, they'd quickly want that to be reduced if they knew waste was in there. But I think there's that thing I said right at the start about everybody takes a step back when it comes to responsibility because nobody's job is really to be responsible for the cloud spend. So everybody kind of goes, oh well, my job's to write this code, or my job's to deliver this project, or my job's to make sure this application has a 3 nines SLA. And even when think about projects. When was the last time you saw a project that had a non-functional requirement that said this application should cost less than $1,000 a month to run, this many users or something like that? It's just not really a thing, is it? And I think that kind of thing I expect to start changing, because people, like Simon said, people will be getting wise to this, and people need the costs to be sustainable. And I think a lot of companies will probably find there'll be things like, I can re-architect an application because the app that I built that really enables our business, but it's costing us 50 grand a month, but I could change it to work like this, and it might cost me 100 grand to change it. Maybe, just a rough example, let's say you move it from a VM to a PaaS service, it might cost you 100 grand to change it, but then you might save 20 grand a month. So in a year's time, you've already started making profit on that investment, and then your application probably lives for the next 10 years or something. So there's a huge saving over a long period of time.
Yeah, massive ROI, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, there's that constant change as well. It's, I guess, the value for money when it was first developed, and then either technology change or business requirements change, and it's probably no longer value for money, but it's built, it's running, it's sat there, and people aren't monitoring it, then don't realise it's.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem, Vin, is really, that there are many problems, but the most common one I see, and the one that probably impacts customers the most, is before we go live, people say, how big does our VM and our database need to be? And they go, let's make it large. And then nobody ever looks at it ever again unless there's a problem. And so they, and things perform well. So they go, yeah, let's just leave it. And then, a few years later, somebody looks at it and goes, oh, this database barely gets touched. And you go, oh shit, we've wasted $1,000 a month for 2 or 3 years. And we could have made it a medium-sized database, and nobody ever looked at it.
Yeah, I guess it's having that, like I said, that tool to monitor it, notify, give you some kind of indication that something needs to be looked at, because people often move to the next project after it's been delivered.
Yeah, it's exactly it. Like, that's why I always say the needle in the haystack. If you have something, tool or scripts or whatever, that helps you find the things that you can look at to get a few cost savings. And I think, like, if any of you are looking at this, the one tip I would say is, when you find some cost savings, make sure you tell people about it, because one of the things I find, it's that PR job where, our whole story there came from somebody, the integration team told the other teams what they were doing, and people became aware that they were like company best practice of how to do this. So then the other teams started getting shouted at because the bill was too big, and they went and looked at, oh, what are the integration team doing? So if you just do a quick blog post internally at your organization to say, we saved $20,000 this last quarter because we did this, it inspires other people to think about what they could do. And then I think one of the trends I'm starting to see as well is like an incentivization. So, often you'll have a company will say, whichever team has the best cost saving this month gets a free night out or something like that. And if you think about, some of the stories there, if you offered a team, if that team saves $1,000, they get 200 a month. They get a $200 night out for the team or something. It's a really good spend of your money, because it pays itself back in a month, and the team morale goes up, and they get motivated to do some cost savings on top of their day job.
Yeah. That sounds like a great idea. Yeah. And also think as well from a sustainability. There's a lot of push now in organizations being more sustainable. This will have a CO2 cost to it as well, and thinking about it like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really common, that it's going to be a new theme. People, you see it already a little bit when they talk about ESGs and green software and stuff. And actually, if you outsource a lot of it to the cloud, the lower you make your cloud bill, the more you're kind of contributing to good causes for the environment, aren't you?
Yeah.
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 There's a cloud carbon calculator I've used once to try and work out the carbon saving of moving a workload from on-prem to cloud. It's very approximate arm wavy stuff, but you can demonstrate that, which is sometimes helpful for public procurement if you can show that you achieve a 30% carbon reduction for a given workload.
Yeah, especially as if Microsoft, as they move towards their carbon, neutral and carbon negative, isn't it? Where they want to get rid, take all the carbon out that they've ever put into the atmosphere, and then they want to then start, taking carbon out of the environment. Yeah,
so I think one point there is if you think about your own data center, these people who are migrating an on-prem data center to the cloud, you're never going to do that with your own data center, but Microsoft are doing it for you when you've got your stuff running on Azure, so you can again tick some boxes in that space by running your environment on the cloud.
Yeah.
Just thinking about some of the cost savings on VMs, because VMs are the most cost-intensive way of running a workload, aren't they? And I'm thinking of projects where years ago people migrated everything to a VM and they've never touched it since because it's never broken, and it's such an expensive way to run a workload.
There are other ones though, Dylan, as well. So we've got a podcast coming out with the Cosmos DB team. It's a really interesting chatting to one of their guys, because a lot of people I've spoke to about Cosmos. It's an interesting service because you can do a lot of stuff for next to no cost with Cosmos, and there's a really good free tier on it as well. But then as your application scales up, people struggle to understand, how do I run Cosmos cost effectively, because it can be expensive as well. But there's a lot of things, you like one of the roles that's missing is in a SQL database, you've got your DBA that makes sure your database is running efficiently from a performance perspective. But in Cosmos, step one is cloud performance is directly related to cloud cost. But then you don't really have a DBA concept for Cosmos in the same way. So who's thinking about your indexes, and who's thinking about your partition keys and your query optimizations and stuff? It's a lot more of a difficult challenge. But then as we were chatting, you kind of realize, well, the thing is as well with Cosmos though, if you want to run, if you build your application to use Cosmos effectively, at the same time you can have a globally distributed Cosmos that can dynamically scale based on burst usage scenarios. You think if you try to achieve the same outcome with a typical relational database, it would be so difficult to do it. And I think that's where sometimes it's like there's the element of keep it simple, then there's the middle ground, but then the high, the real high performance applications can really benefit from some of these services that can kind of offload a lot of the hard work for you. It's things like like service bus is a really good example. We were talking at the Integrate Summit last week about the new DR feature in the service bus, and one of the challenges has always been, like, if you're doing messaging at scale, and you used to have to almost pair two namespaces and do a lot of the hard work yourself to get global DR. But now, if you're a customer who can afford the more expensive SKUs, you can turn on DR and it'll do sync or async replication of messages across regions just by turning it on. And you think, like, the cost of doing that kind of complex architecture, doing it yourself would have been really difficult. But offloading that to Microsoft to do it for you means, one, again, coming back to cost, you just pay a fairly flat rate and they do it for you. But coming back to consumption and sustainability for the environment and stuff, doing that kind of replication yourself across multiple data centers, the sort of cost of doing it, plus the the energy usage and the things you would never get back yourself, because you wouldn't invest your own time in balancing your own carbon footprint for that data center for your usage, because you can never work out what it would be. How are we doing for time, guys? Are we normally finish about 8:30, do you? Or
we'll go over a bit. Yeah. Yeah. So we finish when people are ready to finish, to be honest. So yeah.
When the
But yeah,
talking
I mean-
stops.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, I think it's really fascinating. Mike. Yeah, I'm gonna have to have a look at your YouTube channel and stuff. You know, have a look at that. So yeah.
so for those of you who are consultancy companies as well, we are doing partnerships because we're finding a lot of companies that are interested in partnering over FinOps to do like cost management stuff for customers. So if anybody's interested in that kind of thing, give me a shout as well.
Yeah, I can think of one in particular. Actually, thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, I can definitely think of some scenarios where it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Free money always makes sense. Saving money, at least.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the ultimate challenge, isn't it? So
Money saved is money not
Yeah.
spent. It is, but obviously you have to pay for Michael's amazing toys first. But it's being able to demonstrate a return on investment is the key thing. Yeah, definitely.
Well, you can, let's be clear. User group, you can do it with your own tools. You can do it with Power BI. The idea of third-party tools is they're trying to make life easier for you to get to focus on what you want to do. But there are companies I've spoke to who write their own scripts and that kind of thing and whatnot. The key thing for today, for me, if you want to come and chat about our tool, I think it'll really help you and you'll get a really good ROI. But really, the key thing is projects you're working on, go back and start thinking about how much do we spend here? Do we have any waste? Do we think, like Simon said, do we think we could save some money here that we could invest somewhere else? And maybe it's things like think how many projects don't do DevOps very well. Well, suddenly if I can save you 40, 50 grand a year, you can maybe buy a DevOps person to come and address your DevOps problems.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how many times have you seen Azure? Well, Agile done right. Now, technically, there is no right or wrong because it's a methodology. So, how many times have you seen Scrum done right?
Yeah.
Not very often, if ever.
I think if you are doing agile, I really think that that idea of when you do a sprint retrospective, including a cost element in it of, what do our costs look like this month? What are we spending that we like the look of? What are we spending money on that we don't like the look of? Can we take a work item in the development environment to go and validate? It can be little things like, a really great example is going to be, we've got a function app that really heavily logs into App Insights and Log Analytics. And if that's a heavily used App Insights, you could get quite big Log Analytics and App Insight costs quite easily. And you might start noticing in development that that's more than what you expect it to be. So, if you think about something like, we in dev, we're seeing this is costing us $50 a month. We haven't even thought about what that would cost. And you go, well, how is that going to scale in production when we've got significantly more load? Suddenly that might cost you $400 or $500 a month that you hadn't planned into your calculator budgeting. And then you might be able to go and do something like tune the login in the host.json file to say, do sampling or reduce the log level on certain functions to be errors and warnings and information only on certain functions. You might save a load of money that you can tune during development, whereas you think after go live, it becomes much more difficult to make those kind of changes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Sounds. Yeah, so many opportunities, aren't there? So many opportunities.
A really good product would be someone who could take a SQL database that's currently on vCore and or currently on DTU
and tell you for a fact what the cost is going to be on VCore. Because it's not. It's always a well, we don't know. We'll have to turn it and see what happens. We can give you an indication, but it's difficult because obviously DTU caps you at a certain throughput. If it's uncapped, it's going to go higher. So you can't tell the cost until you do it. So I love the ability to capture a week's worth of activity like the old trace, and then from that calculate how much would that have cost in VCore. That would be good.
Yeah.
Because I'm never able to answer that question. Would it be cheaper to go to VCore? Don't know. Might be. But also really might not be.
Yeah, it's a good question. It gets difficult, when you get to they're the questions I really like, because for me they're some of the harder questions, and actually for most customers that we speak to, that they're asking, or they're struggling with much simpler things. But I think what you want to get at a typical customer, you want to get past all the simple low hanging fruit and get to those harder questions. And if you think about if you're a customer, James, where, again, let's take the example, you spend $1 million a year on Azure. If you've got 30% waste in there, just as a ballpark, get that 30% out the way. So you get your waste down to say 5%, where it's you're never going to get, realistically, you're never going to get to zero because things change all the time. But if you get down to 5, I would consider you to be pretty efficient. And I think one of the things we're starting to think about is this idea of like a fridge. You buy a new fridge and it gives you an efficiency rating, that DCAT rate and stuff. So I think rating companies about you're an F, you're an E kind of thing. If you get yourself to an A, then you can spend time looking at those harder problems, because I think if you think about a tool, it's really difficult for a tool to even if you think about just building scripts from scratch, you need the traffic, but then you need to think about, well, what's it's more than just the traffic. What's the storage we're accessing? How are the queries going to perform? And really, what you'd get back to, I think, would be you'd have to just try it and see how it performs with a load test, is what it's really going to come back to, because everything's always going to be a bit of an estimate.
Yeah.
But for me, what I would see is bringing cost to be, instead of being 6 months after go live when people start looking at cost, if you're looking at cost from the development and testing part of your life cycle, that it's entirely feasible in your project, you could actually use load testing on Azure. You test that database with a DTU model, then you test it with a VCore model with a simulated load. And because you're doing, Terraform or Bicep, you build your database, you then trash it, you then rebuild it a different way, hammer it again, see how they perform. And that's where an Azure expert should be spending their time on them hard problems. Whereas at the minute, yeah, exactly, we find most people's time gets sucked up doing all the really simple things, like, we've got 100 VMs, which one do we, or even stupid things like, we've got a support task that nobody can do. It goes to the Azure expert, but it's such a simple, naughty thing that it annoys you because you're wasting time doing something you feel other people should be able to do. And they're the kind of, Turbo 360, that is a principle. They're the kind of problems we're trying to solve, is to make it so that people who aren't Azure experts can do more in that support space, to allow the Azure expert to focus on the hard problems that you can't just offload.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's very good, really good. Right, I'm gonna have to go. Please feel free to stay on if you want to chat. But it's lovely to see you, Mike. Are you going to be Leeds soon again?
I'll give you a shout next time I'm down. I'll get down there once in a while. So sometimes a user group, or sometimes if I'm visiting